Welcome to the Business Trendsetter Podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Bartone.
We're Spark Partners. We're here every week discussing all things trends, all things business. And there's something that we work with our clients on, and that is really looking around the corner and to see what's coming down the pike. You know, we work a lot with trends, so we oftentimes get some very early readings on what's happening in the economy with certain sectors or certain things. And so today we're going to discuss why some other folks in the media have looked to potentially Spark Partners as the vanguard here. And as that old adage says, that imitation is the highest form of flattery. And so with that, Adam, that's kind of the backdrop, and we're going to go into specifics on what this means. But there was an article that came out recently that kind of might show and illustrate why that is possible, why that's happening. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah. So back on May the 17th, we did a podcast. We published a podcast about the future of electricity. And what we did was we went over the electric utility industry and talked about what was going to happen in the future. And we created some scenarios and we did some forecasts. And we used that as a case study to talk about how people could do good scenario planning. Well, lo and behold, we're recording this on May 29th, but on May 28th, 11 days after that podcast came out, the Washington Post published an article by Shannon Osaka. And the title of it was, How a Simple Fix Could Double the Size of the U.S. Electricity Grid. So anybody out there can go look it up. And what I would do is ask you to listen to our podcast from May 17th and then read this article and ask yourself if Miss Osaka possibly listened to our podcast prior to publishing the article. But because basically she took a chunk out of our podcast and talked about the reconducting element. And that was where we discussed putting new wires on the existing poles and how you could double the transmission rates by putting these new wires up. And so she talked about what it was, which we talked about, how easy it was to do, and then why utilities ignore it, which we described the economics, how utilities are paid means it's better off to put new poles up. She went over that. And that changing regs were in favor of getting towards reconducting. Right. All of the points which we covered in the podcast. Now, why would we want to talk about this? Well, because we're not as famous as the Washington Post.
Not yet, at least.
And it's important whenever we do things and we make predictions to tell people, like, look, you can go to these very famous places, Fortune, Forbes, Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and you'll see that often these journals come out with articles that reflect what we've been saying in our podcast. And it's important to recognize that this has happened hundreds of times, not tens of times. I wrote 425 articles for Forbes, and I got copied over, just literally thousands of times. And that archive, I quit writing for Forbes in 2018 because they couldn't pay me enough to make it worth my while. But that archive is still one of the most popular archives on Forbes magazine. It still gets hit several hundred times a month, where people go back from all those old the predictions I made, look at how I put the scenario together and bring it forward. And it's important for us to sometimes sit back and recognize that we're out there making these predictions before the media comes to them, Right. And that's what people that are listening to this should recognize that. I mean, that's what a good coach does. If you think about what a coach is doing in a baseball game, it's baseball season now. He's thinking about what hitter is going to do best against which pitcher, or which pitcher is going to do best against which hitter, whichever side you're on. He's thinking about positioning people. And sometimes you do a sacrifice fly intentionally in order to advance somebody, or bunt in order to advance somebody. You're thinking about what's likely to happen in the game, and you're calling it. Whether it's any sport, that's what a coach does. And that's right. What we're sitting here doing on our podcast, is we're taking the data that we bring in, we accumulate, and we're saying, look, this is how the game is likely to get played. And especially because when I use a game analogy, I always like to tell people the reason business isn't like sports is because in sports there's rules. In business, there are very few rules. I mean, there's some regulations for sure, but how you conduct your business, your strategy, it's a huge variety. I mean,
and I think that's part of the strength of it, is that you're not really beholden to a certain set of rules.
Yes.
Laws, of course, and your own ethics, of course. But besides that, it's open range.
Yeah, and that's what strategy is all about, right?
Yeah. And I think that, one of the things about this podcast is that I will be the first to say that this podcast is not for everyone. We don't always have the most tasty morsels of a meal here, but we do offer some nutrition that only some can really absorb, right? were kind of an acquired taste. And, I've got friends that have listened to it and they said, yeah, it was kind of nice, but they're not growth mindset. They don't have that growth mindset. They don't really see the value until it comes to the fact that their businesses are crumbling. And then they come back to us, and then that's when they see our value.
Well, you've probably heard the phrase that 9 out of 10 small businesses fail. And the reality is that if you take into account businesses that end because people retire and there's nowhere for the business to go, the reality is more than 9 out of 10 fail. In other words, they don't get bought by somebody and continue to advance it as business. And the reason is that most small business people and most leaders of small and mid-sized companies are reactive. And they're saying, I go to work and I do what I do every day. And the market's changing around them. And these market shifts happen and they don't prepare for them. And then when the shift happens, they're not competitive anymore. And so then they end up, the business closes. Now, of course, we know the restaurant industry has got a very high infant mortality rate and just a high mortality rate. Why? Well, because people's tastes change. For a while, they want to eat a certain kind of food, but they grow weary of it and they want something different. So they want eclectic opportunities out there. So if you open a restaurant and you open it and you don't change your menu for 20 years, you're not very likely to be successful, right? And you have to be aware of who the competition is, what people do. Do they want to dine in? Do they want to dine al fresco outside? Do they want to carry out? Do they want to have it delivered? And what kind of food? Are they into spicy food? Are they into European food? Are they into highly interesting dishes or dishes that they would consider home cooked type meal? I mean, but those, you have to reflect that. And if we see that in restaurants all the time, but what we forget is it's happening all around us. It's happening to us in construction, design, architecture variations. It's happening in how cities change the rules around what they're going to what they want in the city in terms of retail versus commercial versus residential, and residential single family versus multifamily, all those sorts of things. And we're out in front of that. We're telling people, look, this is what's going to happen to commercial real estate. This is what's going to happen to the price of rents. We wind the clock back over 2 years. In one of our earlier podcasts, we interviewed a fellow that had a brewery. And one of the things on his mind as he was trying to grow his business is whether he should buy a building in order to expand his brewery. And we were very clear. This was well over 2 years ago in the pandemic. We said, do not buy a building because there's going to be way too much space available. And you'll be able to get cheaper rent in next year and the year after that and the year after that.
And here we are.
Yeah. I mean, we were right on. We knew where the market was headed. There's going to be open space. And this guy was able to renegotiate his lease every year to a lower number without having that big fixed cost and being tied to that nut on that mortgage. So that's what the thing is that we still recognize that we're looking around these corners. And the fact that we beat the media, most of the time we're there before the typical media. My blog that I wrote for Forbes, I used to have the editors all over my butt because they would say, well, we're not reading this in the Wall Street Journal. And I'll say, give it 3 months. I'll make my prediction. You publish it, and we'll see what happens. And it turned out when I quit writing for them, I was the only guy who had never been wrong with any of my predictions. So I beat the market considerably. And that's the key that you want to be as a competitor. Mm-hmm. You want to be ahead of the competition. You want to be thinking about how to use new technologies, how to anticipate the future early. And the reason that we do this, and I think that why are we so successful, is because of our ability to track trends. Before I met you, Manny, you're aware back at the turn of the century, I started a trend tracker. I've been doing that now 25 years. I had this trend tracker. We keep track of, I personally, working with you, keep track of about 600 trends. We're always looking at what's going on. We add trends and delete trends as it makes sense. But looking at demographics, looking at where people live, by looking at the actual data, it gives us a much better sense of what's likely to happen. And then, of course, what we do is we're able to make predictions. Well, we do predictions in podcasts, but what we do in real life are scenarios, right? We sit down with companies and we say, this is what the future's going to look like, and here's how you can play it out. So we plan big scenarios. So where the media stops is they always say this is the past. So that's kind of like your accounting system. Your accounting system tells you what your sales were, tells you what your profits were, what your cash flow was. But what it doesn't do is tell you what it's going to look like in a year.
Exactly.
The media is like that. They're sitting there reporting on what was. So even in this article that Ms. Osaka wrote, she doesn't say what this means. She just, are they going to reconduct? Are they going to run the wires? When will they run the wires? How quickly will it happen? What's the implication of this? When will all of these widespread sustainable energy projects come online? There's no predictions in there. And that's where we're very different. because we do predict. Remember in that May 17th, I said, folks, down the line, I'm not exactly sure when, could be a decade, but electricity would become free
Yeah.
because we played out the scenario. And we could see how, with the change in regs that happened, reconducting, all these other things that were occurring,
Right.
the baseline was being built where we would have more capacity than there was demand. And that would make electricity be monitored more like the cell phone service rather than a per use service like the long distance was in the 1970s.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a business owner or executive and you're interested in growing your business, wouldn't you want to have the data from a different perspective? You know, oftentimes we get invited to speak with clients and we're not in their particular industry. And there's always going to be the naysayers around the table. Sometimes it's the old curmudgeon or the Dr. No, if, as it were, who says, well, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You're not from this industry. And actually, that's the power, because we're not looking at it from the swamp where you are. We're looking at it from the top of the mountain where we have perspectives in lots of areas. Matter of fact, there's been many times when I've been able to use, and I know you too as well, Adam, have been able to use data from one completely different market to another and tie them together. And there's so much power there that actually ends up being a huge boost for the client company. So you're absolutely right, Adam. There's a huge value in what we can provide, and that early warning. I mean, 10 days is not a lot of time, but it could be the world if you're trying to make a decision on beating your competition to the punch.
So let's take, for example, again, this whole topic of electricity. Many people would say, I don't care about electric utilities. All I know is I complain about my electric bill being too high, right? And so when you have that attitude, then you start saying, well, okay, this is the way it's always going to be. Electricity is going to be expensive. But when we played out our scenario, showing how reconducting is one element of what's happening in terms of the industry, how it's shifting, the sustainable productions and all this kind of stuff, that this capacity was going to grow. And what that means is that is you could be an early adopter of that wave. So what have we been promoting? We've been saying to on the podcast, but also to clients, if you have a big trucking business and you're not an over-the-road trucker, you're somebody who trucks things around inside the city or trucks things out to a customer back, in a, say 100, 150 mile radius. Now is the time to be really evaluating the transferring from a gasoline powered or propane or a diesel powered fleet to an electric fleet, because the price of electricity is going to go down. And so when you run the economics, don't use old prices, use new prices, and then take a look at, the maintenance you're going to save, maintenance costs you'll save, et cetera, and start to see that now's the time to really be strongly considering that transition. And maybe you don't transition your whole fleet today, but you start that transition. And you can start learning about batteries and about, the installations where you can, how do you actually charge up an entire fleet? And then if you're going to do that, how much solar or wind do you want to put right on your own property? I mean, if you've got a couple of acres or 3 acres of land, you've got enough there to put some solar on your buildings, got some, maybe put a windmill up or something like that, so that you produce your own electricity. And then you can have your own batteries internally. And you see, It plays out very strongly for a small business. And now's the time to be thinking about how you transition your energy consumption so that you can take advantage of the grid, be a part of the grid, and possibly be in a position to be not only operating with no costs in terms of fuels, but at the same time selling electricity back to the grid, which is already started in many locations. So instead of paying for electricity, you're selling electricity. So these things, you can say to yourself, a utility doesn't matter, but it does in your business today. And then especially if you have the fuel costs in terms of transport fleet or in terms of your building or in terms of your manufacturing process, then you want to be thinking about where this is going. And the media can't tell you that. You have to have a coach that can tell you that, somebody that can sit down and say, this is how the game's going to be played in the future, and these are the moves that are likely to win.
Right. I think there's a lot of power there as well. If you think about the mainstream business media, the Fortune magazines, the Newsweek, the Washington Post and whatnot, they provide a very well-balanced, across the landscape kind of viewpoint on certain things, but they're not going to be sitting there beside you looking at your business, looking at your customers, looking at the way you do business, your value delivery to support you in growing it. And I think that, you having the background in the trends and me being out in front and actually being an entrepreneur and working with companies. And I'm currently at this company, Infrared Labs, and it's a lot of really good stuff happening there. And I'm using all that I know from the Spark Partner side to advance that company forward. And guess what? We are advancing forward. A lot of good things happening.
So let's take a look again at the process we use, how we apply it with clients, and how the clients how people that listen to this podcast can apply it themselves. And a big part of this is actually accumulating the data and then using that to make these predictions, not running on your gut, definitely not running on your gut, nor running upon common perceptions. Most people make decisions based upon their bias, something from a long time ago, they're biased, and what their perception is of what's happening in the world around them. Because most people don't go collect a lot of data, to be honest. I mean, you might have had to do it in school to write a report, but once you're out of school, most people are glad they don't have to do that anymore. They say, I got all the data about my business I need. Well, no, because you're not looking outside at the marketplace. You're looking at your internal business. So you're trying to make decisions with your internal data, which is like a journalist. All you're doing is looking in the past. This is what's been. It doesn't tell you what's going to be in the future, and therefore help you to make your future decisions. But, it's by doing that we, you and I both, we give presentations. And often we're out there and we say something to people and they look at us like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, why would I do that? And I go back to when the Model S came out. I had been doing a lot of research around what was happening with cars and electrification cars. And when the Model S came out, I knew that electric cars really had the future. And I started writing about that for Forbes. And the people at General Motors were so angry that they contacted the publisher, Steve Forbes, and wanted to be fired and threatened to pull their advertising from the magazine because I was saying that electrification was coming and the traditional big three auto companies were not going to step up to the plate, and the market would be left for this guy from out of nowhere to come in and make a big buzz in the business. And they, of course, came back arguing that, hey, DeLorean tried this, Fisker tried this, people have tried this, and they've all failed, and Musk will fail too. And here's all the reasons they'll fail. And I just stuck by my guns. And I kept saying, nope, here's all the reasons that the market is changing, that buyer behavior is changing, that costs are changing in such a way that it favors Tesla being successful, and those that get into electric cars early will be successful. So that is the kind of thing that people hear. And, today everybody's like, yeah, electric cars are out there. Some people still think electric cars aren't going to be successful, much to my amazement. But it gets at that, how we can predict. When we saw when Jerome Powell started to raise interest rates, you and I on this podcast were very, very vocal that was a bad move, that the inflation was not being caused by cash flow management, like, the 1970s when the Federal Reserve was pumping out too much money, but rather because all these factories got shut down. And whenever you suddenly said, okay, the pandemic's over, everybody can go out and spend money again, well, those factories didn't come. You can shut down a factory in a week. You can't bring it back up alive in a week. You have to decide if it's even worth doing. When will demand come back? How fast? So that production is going to come behind the demand. The demand will be out front, and that's going to drive up prices. And we said, Powell's going to raise interest rates, but it will not cause a recession. That's not going to happen. It's just going to hurt the economy, and it's going to hurt people. And then it did. It cratered home building. It cratered resale. Something like 20% of all realtors out there don't have any business. The typical realtor now sells 2 houses a year because the realtor, with interest rates so high and mortgages so high, the real estate market just crashed, right? And we predicted all those things were going to happen. So if you were ahead of that curve, you got your house sold if you wanted to sell it before the crash happened, right? Before these interest rates got so high. What were we looking at? We're looking at demographics. That's the biggest thing we kept saying. The demographics mean that people need to get hired. The retirees aren't going to come back into the marketplace. They're not going to get rehired. And that's going to keep demand high and production is going to be low. And therefore, there won't be a recession. So to this day, I think that the Federal Reserve is still looking at the wrong data. They're not paying attention to where things are really going. But it's really important to look at these data and bring out that idea of like, what are the factors that are important? What's going to drive the future? And not use common perception, because people will have a common perception. And when you sit around a group, we mostly talk about the common perception, and most people in media talk about the common perception. You know what they want? They want listeners. They want advertisers to pay another program. They want listeners. They want readers. And if you appeal to somebody's common perception, they read it. If you're off the common perception and you say things, then people will be kind of like, yeah, well, do I really want to pay attention to that? As you said, that's why we can be a bit of a challenge to people on this podcast, because we don't often talk in terms of the common perception.
Yeah, and I think one of the powers that we bring to the table is when we look at layering of trends, like not just one trend, not just a singular trend, but trends tied together. I mean, the podcast last week, we discussed the issues with the grid, but why is that important? Who's demanding the additional electricity? Well, of course, demographics have shifted and people are moving to different places. And of course, AI is a big deal. And of course, the electrification of the automobile is a big deal. So all these things are multiple trends that are pointing towards the need for a revamp of the grid. And so I think in your business, if you have something that is interesting like that, give us a ring, send us an email, manny@sparkpartners.com or adam@sparkpartners.com. And we'd love to talk with you about how we can help be on your side, looking out in the future, seeing how we can support you.
So let me go back again to this idea of the common perception, right? Or what I'm going to call the common myth, because I've seen it now for 20 years. And now the Harris and the Guardian, the two publishers, got together in a poll to ask people in the United States what they thought about the economy. Okay. Let me give you some of these questions and let me see what you say. What do you suppose they answered, but the poll, what was the polling answer to the question, is the S&P 500 up or down for the year? What do you think people said?
I think people said it's down.
Yeah, they did. 49% of people said the S&P 500 is down. It's actually up 12%. And last year it was up 24%. This year, for the first time ever in the history of the Dow Jones, the DJIA busted over 40,000. The highest peak it's ever been. Yet half the people asked about the economy, which said that, oh, no, the stock market's down, not up. Think about how far off do you have to be in that perception? So the implications of it are tremendous. I mean, if you've been an investor, you've done very, very well. If you stayed out because you thought the market was down, you've done poorly. So just as an investor, it's affected you. If you're looking at being able to raise money in the future, we know that new listings are going up, right? New people going onto the NASDAQ are going up. It's not a bad time to IPO. It's not as good as some other times, but it's not bad, right?
Right.
So for small business, it's important to know. But if you're sitting around with a bunch of people and half of them think the S&P is down, you're going to have the wrong conversation. Here's another one. Is inflation up or down this year?
I would venture to say that people would think that it's up.
72% of the answers were that inflation was up and increasing this year. The reality is that this year, inflation is 3.4%. It's down from 2022 when it was 9%. In fact, inflation is at the lowest rate since Jerome Powell first started saying inflation was a problem. So we've actually driven inflation down, and this year we will at worst be at 3% inflation, which is considered the norm, right? Across long periods of time, it's 2 to 3%. Yet 72% of the people thought that prices were going up this year substantially.
And mind you, a lot of big companies know this about bias. And so they know that people are really thinking that inflation's up. So they'll actually, I don't know if you've heard of the whole sizeflation and all that, where they, used to be an actual half gallon of ice cream. Now it's like 3/4 of that, and they're shrinking shrinkflation, they call it.
Yeah.
Same thing with potato chips. They're taking this as an opportunity to blame quote unquote inflation, when in fact it's just a corporate strategy to up their profits. I mean, I think it's brilliant. It's not a nice thing to do, but it's brilliant.
Well, let's take that ice cream one for example. Back during the pandemic, one of our podcasts, I talked about how much milk production was going offline. There was, in the pandemic, problems with distribution of milk. It was a problem. Remember, people couldn't work. People weren't going into stores. There were all these issues. And so Wisconsin, for example, has a lot of small dairy farms, family farms that maybe had under 100 head of milkers. And something like 75% of those just quit. They were dumping their milk on the ground. They couldn't feed the cows anymore. They just gave up and they eliminated the herd and called it quits, right? Big dairy farmers were barely making by it. Again, dumping just tremendous amounts of milk, which is going right back onto the ground because they couldn't get it out in terms of products that people wanted. People weren't buying as much milk, cheese, and ice cream and those kinds of things during the pandemic. What happens is the pandemic ends, people get excited again. They go to the store. Now they want to buy ice cream. And the reality is that we got to rebuild those herds. We got to get the production back up, right? You got to get the plants open again. So what do? Oh my gosh, people want more. The demand for ice cream doubles. Well, if we double the price, that's going to be difficult. So as you said, let's shrink the container and try to keep the price closer to what it was. Now that is inflation. There's no doubt about that. That's inflation. But at the same time, it's not an inflation driven by the money supply. It's inflation that's driven by demand and supply, production, and those things, which we keep a track of. Let's take a look at that recession idea, though. What do you suppose people said when they were asked about whether we were in or headed for a recession?
I'd say overwhelmingly people think we're headed into a recession.
56% of the people said we're in a recession right now. Currently sitting in a recession right now. When the reality is we're in the fourth consecutive year of a great expansion. Fourth consecutive year of an expansion. So yes, we had a contraction in the economy back at the pandemic, but now things have changed. We've had a tremendous amount of government infusion in terms of legislation that brought money to the market to build chip plants, to get manufacturing back online. We've got more people working. We've been adding, on average, 200,000 plus jobs a month to the economy for 3 years. Wages have gone up over 4% per year for the last 2.5 years. All the metrics would say that we're in one of the best economies we've had since the 1960s. One of the best since the 1960s, yet 56% of people think we're in a recession today, right? So why is that important? Because during a recession, during these kinds of times, it's a good idea to be making these investments in the right place. And today I would tell when somebody comes to me and says, well, I'm afraid to invest. I'm afraid I'll fall into a recession. The answer is now's a good time to invest because demand's going up. The economy is doing well. Our economy is doing the best in the world. We're doing better than all the economies of Europe. We're doing better than Japan. We're doing better than China. Doing way better than Russia. I mean, it's amazing how well our economy is doing. Like I said, fourth consecutive year. So let's go back to when asked if the economy would worsen, they said over the next year. What do you suppose they said?
Percentage-wise, I would say 58% say it would worsen.
Now what?
58.
You are exactly correct.
Really? Okay.
58% said that the economy is worsening this year, going to get worse. But all economic indicators are up. As I was saying, GDP is up, exports are up, imports are down. We're actually buying more of our own stuff and we're sending more stuff to other markets, and jobs were way up. 49% think that unemployment is at a 50-year high. 49% said unemployment is at a 50-year high, right, when in reality, we're at the lowest employment since 1972. Unemployment has been higher consistently from 1973 all the way up until this year than it was this year. You got to think about that. I mean, how many people listening to this podcast were alive in 1973? Right?
I was born in 73, so.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Like, this is the best unemployment rate we've ever had. The reality is that we've been under 4% for 2 consecutive years. That hasn't happened since the Nixon administration. Think about that. That's how good employment is. Our unemployment numbers are low, our employment numbers are high, the jobs numbers are high, yet 58% of people think that we're in a terrible jobs market with a terrible economy. So again, what I'm back to is this, what I would call the, bad news bias, right? People kind of want to hear bad news. I don't know that I understand that, but the reality is people just expect things to be worse. And I found this quote. This is a guy I'd never heard of before. His name is Brian Riedl, R-I-E-D-L. And he's with the Manhattan Institute, one of those Washington think tanks, okay?
Right.
Well, now, they're generally considered to be more conservative than liberal. That's the take on them, right? But here's what he said about people in Poland. This is a quote. Nearly everyone thinks they are getting screwed on everything. The economy is always declining. You pay all the taxes and you get none of the benefits. Everything is a conspiracy. The world is always getting worse. I thought that was quite a quote from this fellow at the Manhattan Institute.
Wow.
But the reason I bring all this together is that when they did this poll, the common perception wasn't off. It wasn't wrong. It was spectacularly wrong. It was amazingly off base, right? And the reality is how can you plan for the future if those are the bases, if that's what you're using to make decisions?
Yeah.
Well, it's really important that you don't just sit around in a room with a bunch of your buddies, men or women, and start to say, hey, look, how would you make a decision? Because the common myth will lead you most of the time to make the wrong decision.
Very well said, Adam. And yeah, bias is the foundation of that, whether it's your own bias or the bad news bias or whatever. So if you want more support from us, give us an email, Manny@sparkpartners.com, Adam@sparkpartners.com. We really have a lot to offer when it comes to looking out into the future, helping you to remove those glasses of bias and make the right decisions based on real data.
Thank you, Manny. And again, folks out there, it's always about getting the data, using the trends to make your predictions and develop your scenarios. It was Wayne Gretzky, I skate to where the puck will be, the phrase that everybody's heard more than they want to hear it, but it's the truth. If you look at tremendous athletes, they're in the right place at the right time to make the right shot, to do the right thing. And that's what we want to do, is help businesses be in the right place at the right time to maximize their sales and profits. And you're not going to do that if you're running your business by looking in the rearview mirror or talking to your mailman.
Very well said, Adam. With that, we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Manny.